My family hid my husband's betrayal with my sister for 2 years, and when I condemned my mother for it, she returned from prison and attacked me. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who checked her fiancé's phone. I always believed that trust was the foundation of any relationship, and Nick and I had been together for 4 years. We were engaged, planning a wedding, discussing future kids, looking at houses. My life felt secure, until last night. Nick had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from another long day at work. I was just going to move his phone off his chest when the screen lit up. It was a message from my best friend, Kelly. I miss you already. Last night was perfect. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My brain scrambled for a reasonable explanation. Maybe she sent it to the wrong person? Maybe she was talking about someone else? But then my gut twisted because deep down, I already knew. My hands were shaking as I unlocked his phone. The passcode had been the same for years, my birthday. I hesitated. If I went through with this, I couldn't unsee whatever I found. But something in me, something screaming that I had been played for a fool, pushed me forward. Facebook Messenger. I typed Kelly's name in the search bar, but there were no recent messages. My stomach sank. He had deleted their conversation. That was proof in itself. But then I noticed something, a folder I'd never seen before. A hidden group chat. I tapped on it, expecting maybe some dumb work chat or an old friend group. Instead, what I saw made my entire body go numb. It was a chat with Nick, Kelly, my mother, my sister Lauren, my cousin Emily, and even my aunt. I scrolled up. Kelly, I feel so bad sometimes. She's so excited about the wedding. Lauren, don't feel bad. She'll never find out, and honestly, they're not even a good match. Emily, she'd be better off anyway. She's too sensitive. He needs someone like you, Kelly. My mother, I just don't want any drama at the wedding. If she finds out before then, it'll ruin everything. Nick, relax. She's clueless. I couldn't process what I was reading. My own family, my own mother, knew about this? For over 2 years? They weren't just covering for him, they were encouraging it. My breathing became shallow. I felt like I was outside my body, like I was watching this happen to someone else. I kept scrolling, finding more messages about how it's better this way, how I wouldn't understand, how they didn't want to hurt me. Nick stirred on the couch, and I froze. I needed to get out of there. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, my jacket, and bolted out the door. I didn't even know where I was going. I just drove. I ended up at a 24-hour diner on the other side of town, staring at my coffee as my mind raced. The betrayal was so deep, I didn't know where to start. My fiancé, my best friend, my family. It wasn't just one person lying to me, it was everyone. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I couldn't break down here, not now. I needed to think. I needed a plan. I needed to decide how I was going to burn their entire world to the ground. I sat in that diner for what felt like hours, staring at my untouched coffee. The betrayal wasn't just about Nick and Kelly. It was bigger than that. It was deeper, more insidious. My own family had known. They had watched me plan my wedding, listened to me gush about Nick, let me believe I had a loyal best friend. And they had done nothing. No, it was worse than nothing. They had encouraged it. I couldn't go home. I couldn't go anywhere near Nick. Instead, I drove to my mother's house. I needed answers. I needed to hear her admit it to my face. Her porch light was on when I pulled up, even though it was well past midnight. I didn't hesitate. I pounded on the door until she opened it, wrapped in a satin robe, her silver hair tied up in a neat bun. She didn't even look surprised to see me. "Sweetheart," she said, as if I had just stopped by for tea. "What's wrong?" I shoved my phone in her face, the hidden group chat still open. This is what's wrong. For a split second, something flickered in her eyes. Then she sighed and stepped aside. "Come in." I almost laughed at how casual she was. Like I wasn't standing there shaking with rage. Like she hadn't just betrayed me in the worst way possible. I stormed past her into the living room. "How long?" My voice was trembling, but I didn't care. "How long have you known?" She closed the door and walked over to the bar cart, pouring herself a glass of wine. "Oh, honey," she said, shaking her head. "It's not that simple." "Not that simple?" I let out a bitter laugh. "It's exactly that simple. You knew my fiancé was screwing my best friend for 2 years and didn't say a word. And it's not just that. You helped him." She took a slow sip of her wine and sat down on the couch, crossing her legs. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I don't want to sit," I snapped. "I want you to tell me why. Why would you do this to me?" She sighed again, as if I were being dramatic. "Because," Sweetheart, you wouldn't have understood. I stared at her in disbelief. Understood? What exactly wouldn't I have understood? That my fiancé is a lying, cheating piece of garbage? That my best friend, my voice cracked, but I pushed through it, has been sleeping with him behind my back? That my own family thought that was fine? She tilted her head, looking at me like I was some naive child throwing a tantrum. Nick loves you, and he loves Kelly. I simply suggested he talk to you about the possibility of an open relationship. I almost choked on my own breath. An open relationship? My hands clenched into fists. You wanted me to share him? She rolled her eyes. Don't be so close-minded, dear. Your brother and sister have open marriages. It works for them. I felt like the room was tilting. That's their choice. I never agreed to that. I never wanted that. My mother took another sip of wine. And that's exactly why we didn't tell you. We knew you'd react like this. A cold, ugly laugh bubbled up in my throat. Oh, I'm so sorry my reaction isn't convenient for you. Footsteps thudded down the stairs. My brother, Ryan, appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. He was shirtless, wearing sweatpants, his hair disheveled. Jesus, what's with the yelling? I turned to face him. Did you know? My voice was ice. He blinked, still half asleep. Know what? I threw my hands in the air. About Nick. About Kelly. About all of it. His expression shifted, but not to guilt. Not even to shock. Just resignation. Yeah, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I knew. I let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Of course you did. Ryan sighed. Look, I get that you're upset, but relationships are complicated. You and Nick have been together a long time. Maybe this is just an adjustment. I stared at him in horror. An adjustment? My fiancé has been cheating on me for 2 years. There's no adjusting to that. He raised an eyebrow. Have you even talked to him? Maybe he loves you both. My stomach turned. You sound just like Mom. Because Mom's right, he said with a shrug. Monogamy isn't natural. Look at me and Laura. We have a great marriage and we both see other people. I clenched my teeth. That's your choice. I never agreed to that. Maybe you should. My sister's voice chimed in from the hallway. Lauren was standing there, arms crossed over her chest. You're acting like a victim when you could just adapt. I turned to face her. Adapt? She nodded. Nick's a great guy. He loves you, but he also loves Kelly. Why not make it work instead of throwing everything away? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Are you seriously suggesting I stay with him? Lauren rolled her eyes. Men cheat. Okay, that's life. At least he's cheating with someone you know. That's better than him running around with strangers. I shook my head, disgusted. You're all insane. Ryan sighed, stepping forward. You've got 2 choices, sis. You can freak out, burn everything to the ground, and end up alone. Or you can be mature about this. Talk to Nick. Figure out a way to make it work. I wanted to scream. There is no way to make this work. He lied to me. He betrayed me. You betrayed me. My mother stood up, setting her wine glass down. No one betrayed you, sweetheart. We just didn't want to see you hurt. Well, congratulations, I spat. You failed. I turned on my heel and stormed toward the door. My mother called after me. Where are you going? I paused, gripping the doorknob so tightly my knuckles turned white. Away from all of you. And then I walked out, slamming the door behind me. I spent the next few days in a haze, my mind alternating between rage and despair. I had nowhere to go except a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their messages. My mother, my sister, my brother, all conspiring to keep me in the dark. Kelly's words haunted me the most. I feel so bad sometimes. She's so excited about the wedding. The fake sympathy. The smug reassurance from my own family that I was too stupid, too naive to ever find out. They had stolen years of my life, laughing behind my back while I planned a future that was never real. But if they thought I would just slink away quietly, they were wrong. I had a plan. Nick was too arrogant to suspect anything. My family was too self-righteous to believe I'd retaliate. And Kelly, well, she thought she had one. I wasn't just going to expose them. I was going to humiliate them. The rehearsal dinner was in 5 days. That would be the perfect stage for their downfall. Nick's parents, Richard and Diane, lived in a massive colonial house a few towns over. Unlike my family, they had always been kind to me, treating me like their own daughter. I wasn't sure how they'd react, but they deserved to know what kind of son they had raised. I sat in my car outside their house, my thumb hovering over the send button. The screenshots were all there. Pages of conversations detailing the affair, the deception, the betrayal. With one tap, I shattered the illusion they had of their perfect son. Then I got out of the car and knocked on their door. Diane opened it, her face lighting up. "Oh, honey, we weren't expecting you." Richard appeared behind her, smiling. Come in, come in. How's the wedding planning?" I took a deep breath. "We need to talk." As soon as Diane sat down and looked at her phone, her face drained of color. Her hand shot to her mouth. No, no, this can't be right." Richard's expression darkened as he scrolled. "What the hell is this?" "It's the truth." My voice was cold. "Nick has been cheating on me with Kelly for 2 years. My family knew. They helped cover it up." Diane started crying, shaking her head. "Oh, sweetheart, I had no idea. I'm so sorry." Richard's jaw tightened. "That little bastard. And Kelly? We loved her. We thought she was your best friend." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I did too." Diane grabbed my hands, her eyes brimming with tears. "What are you going to do?" I stared at her, my heart pounding. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows." I spent the next few days preparing. The rehearsal dinner was the perfect place for my revenge. It was the final gathering before the wedding, with everyone attending, friends, family, coworkers. I created an automated email set to go out at 8:15 p.m., right in the middle of the speeches. It would send the screenshots to every single guest. Nick's friends, Kelly's parents, my coworkers, his boss, even distant relatives who lived out of state. To ensure no one left early, I played along. I pretended to be fine. I responded to texts. I even messaged Kelly, acting like I was excited for the big day. Her response made me sick. "I can't wait. You're going to be such a beautiful bride." The audacity. Nick, oblivious as ever, texted me sweet messages. "Can't wait to call you my wife." Liar. The night arrived. I wore a white cocktail dress, looking every bit the glowing bride-to-be. My hands trembled as I parked outside the venue, but I forced myself to smile. I had to act normal. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, buzzing with laughter and clinking glasses. My mother kissed my cheek like nothing had happened. My sister and brother beamed at me, smug in their belief that I had come to my senses. Kelly sat beside Nick, looking breathtaking in a tight red dress. She leaned in close, whispering in his ear, giggling like she wasn't about to be exposed in front of everyone. At exactly 8:14 p.m., I stood. "Can I have everyone's attention?" A hush fell over the room. All eyes were on me. Nick smiled, completely unaware of what was coming. "I just want to say how grateful I am," I began, my voice steady, "to my friends, my family, my fiancé." I turned to Nick, locking eyes with him. For being so incredibly honest and loyal to me. His smile faltered. A ripple of confusion passed through the guests. My mother stiffened. Kelly glanced at her phone, frowning. I pulled my own phone from my clutch and pressed play. A robotic voice filled the room, reading aloud the screenshots I had saved. Every filthy message, every disgusting conversation, every instance of my family supporting the affair. Gasps. Then, the dinging started. One phone, then another, then another. Every single guest had just received the same messages. Nick's face drained of color. Kelly's hands flew to her mouth. My mother bolted up from her chair. "Turn that off," she snapped, her voice sharp. But it was too late. Diane was sobbing. Richard was staring at his son like he didn't recognize him. Guests were whispering, scrolling through their phones, shaking their heads in disgust. Nick shot up. "Babe, don't." My voice sliced through the noise. "You don't get to talk. Not after this." Kelly grabbed my arm. "Please, we." I yanked away from her like she was poison. "You." I let out a sharp laugh. "You were supposed to be my best friend. Instead, you spent 2 years screwing my fiancé while my family encouraged it." I turned to my mother. "And you? You suggested I should share him?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The room was silent. I turned to Nick, who looked like he was about to pass out. "You had 2 years to be honest. You let me plan a wedding, let me believe we had a future, while you snuck around with my best friend. And you thought I'd never find out?" "Babe," he stammered, his face red. "It wasn't like that." I laughed. "Oh, it wasn't?" "Because the messages say otherwise." People were leaving. The betrayal, the humiliation, was unbearable for them to witness. Nick's mother slapped him. "How dare you?" she sobbed. "How could you do this to her?" I turned to Kelly. "Hope it was worth it." Then I grabbed my purse, walked out, and left them to wallow in the mess they created. The room had been full of laughter and the clinking of glasses just moments ago. Now, it was suffocatingly silent, except for the endless dinging of phones, one after another. People glanced at their screens, frowning in confusion, then gasping as they read. The messages had gone out. Every single guest at the rehearsal dinner had just received the same horrifying truth. Nick's face twisted in confusion as his phone vibrated on the table. He grabbed it, his eyes scanning the screen, his complexion turning deathly pale. Kelly's hand trembled as she picked up her phone, and before she could react, the murmurs had already begun. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "Is this real? Nick, what the hell is this?" Nick's fingers shook as he scrolled. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "What the?" Kelly let out a sharp breath, covering her mouth. "No, no, no, no." She turned to me, her eyes wild. "You did this?" I smiled. I beamed. "Of course I did." A wave of chaos crashed through the room. People were checking their phones, scrolling, gasping. Some were whispering to each other. Others were outright staring at me, then back at Nick and Kelly. Nick shot up from his seat. "What the hell did you do?" His voice cracked, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "Oh, nothing much," I said, swirling the wine in my glass. "Just made sure everyone knows the truth. About you. About her. About my family and how they all encouraged this." Diane, Nick's mother, was already sobbing into her hands, her shoulders shaking. Richard sat beside her, his face red with fury as he glared at his son. You bastard," Richard spat. "We raised you better than this." Nick whipped toward his father, his voice rising. "Dad, You shut up," Diane choked out between sobs. "You lied to us." To her. "Look at what you've done." Kelly's mother, Linda, had her face buried in her hands, while her father, Greg, stood still, his lips pressed into a thin line. He looked at his daughter, his eyes dark with disappointment. "Kelly," he said slowly, shaking his head, "I don't even know who you are anymore." "Daddy, I don't." His voice was cold. Kelly turned to me, her hands trembling. "You bitch. You ruined my life." I tilted my head. "You ruined mine first." She lunged forward, but before she could get close, a chair screeched as it was pushed back forcefully. Diane slapped her across the face. A sharp crack echoed through the room. "You whore." Diane screamed. "You pretended to be her friend. You sat at our table. You lied to us." Kelly stumbled back, her face red where Diane had struck her. The entire room was in complete disarray now. Some guests were getting up, shaking their heads in disgust. Others were whispering furiously. My mother, on the other hand, had been silent until now. Then she stood. "You absolute brat," she shrieked at me, her face twisted in rage. "You ruined everything. You humiliated me. You ruined this family." I turned slowly to face her. "Oh, I ruined the family?" I laughed, shaking my head. "No, Mom. You did that when you conspired with my fiancé and my best friend to betray me." Grandma Jane and Grandpa Walter had been sitting in stunned silence up until this point, but now my grandmother stood, her wrinkled hands clutching the edge of the table. "You ungrateful girl," she spat. "After all your mother has done for you, this is how you repay her?" I stared at her, my blood running cold. "Done for me?" I repeated slowly. Grandpa Walter nodded in agreement. "You should have just kept quiet," he muttered. "Now look at this mess." I let out a bitter laugh. Kept quiet? While my entire family let my fiancé cheat on me. I looked between them, my voice shaking now. "And you support this? You really think I should have just shut up and married him anyway?" Before they could respond, my Aunt Margaret slammed her hands down on the table. She was my mother's younger sister, always the outcast of the family, always the one my mother sneered at for being too emotional. "Oh, shut the hell up, Mom," Margaret hissed, her eyes burning with rage. My grandmother snapped her head toward her. "Excuse me?" Margaret ignored her, turning to my mother instead. "I should have known you were behind this," my mother scoffed. "Oh, don't act like you're some moral saint, Margaret." Margaret's lips curled into a sneer. "I may not be perfect, but at least I don't wish my own daughter was never born." The room froze. Every conversation halted. Every movement stopped. My breath caught in my throat. "What?" Margaret looked at me, her eyes softening. "She said it. Many times. She never wanted you. She always said she should have aborted you." The world tilted. My mother paled. "Margaret, you bitch." Margaret lunged at her. For the first time in my life, I saw someone physically attack my mother. Margaret grabbed her by the hair and yanked her down, slamming her onto the chair. My mother screamed, struggling, while my aunt got in her face. "You are a monster," Margaret spat. "You let your own daughter get humiliated. You let her fiancé cheat on her. And you have the audacity to play the victim?" My mother slapped her across the face, but Margaret didn't back down. She grabbed my mother's wrist and twisted it, making her yelp. "Stop it!" Grandma Jane shouted, her voice shrill. Diane, still crying, threw her wine at Nick's face. He stumbled back, looking dazed, his once perfect suit now soaked in red liquid. "You disgust me," she choked out. Kelly, realizing she had nothing left, bolted toward the door. Margaret finally released my mother, shoving her back in her seat. My mother glared at her with wild eyes, but Margaret just turned to me and exhaled. "I always knew she was cruel," she muttered, shaking her head. "But I never thought she'd stoop this low." My hands were shaking. I wasn't sure if it was from shock, rage, or grief. Maybe all of them. I turned to my mother, my voice eerily calm. "Is it true?" Her lips parted, but she didn't speak. "Is it true?" I demanded. She let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, don't be so dramatic," Margaret scoffed. "That's all you have to say?" I took a step back, my chest heaving. I felt hollow, like something inside me had cracked open and was now pouring out. I had come here for revenge. I had come here to expose Nick and Kelly. But in the end, I had uncovered something far worse. I wasn't just betrayed. I was never wanted at all. I swallowed hard, ignoring the chaos, ignoring the whispers. I looked at my mother one last time. Then I turned around and walked out. The aftermath of the rehearsal dinner was an avalanche, a chain reaction of destruction I had set in motion. And I didn't regret a single second of it. The morning after, I woke up in Margaret's guest room. I had barely slept. My head pounded, my body ached, and my heart, well, I wasn't sure I had one anymore. It felt hollow, like someone had reached inside my chest and scooped out everything that used to make me feel human. Margaret knocked on the door and pushed it open. "Coffee?" she asked, holding up a steaming mug. I nodded, sitting up slowly. "Thanks." She sat on the edge of the bed, watching me carefully. "It's all over town," I sighed, rubbing my temples. "I figured." She took a slow sip of her own coffee. "Your stepdad's leaving your mom?" I froze. "What?" Margaret smirked. Turns out, George wasn't as clueless as she thought. After last night, he finally dug around. Found out she's been cheating on him for years. He filed for divorce this morning. I let out a sharp breath. I should have felt sorry, but I didn't. My mother had spent her entire life manipulating people, controlling them, and justifying every horrible thing she did. Now, she was finally facing consequences. "She deserves it," I muttered. Margaret nodded. "That's not all." She pulled her phone out and handed it to me. The headline made my stomach flip. "Socialite Callie Bradley cut off from family fortune after betraying best friend." I read further. Callie, Kelly's real name, something she had never told me, probably because she wanted to fit in with normal people, had lost everything. Her father, a wealthy investor, had seen the messages. He had called her that night, humiliated and furious, and told her she was done. No more financial support. No more luxury apartment. No more trust fund. "Jesus," I whispered, scrolling through the article. It detailed how Callie had been spotted in a meltdown outside her building after being locked out, screaming into her phone, begging her father to reconsider. "She had it coming," Margaret said, leaning back against the wall. I nodded, setting the phone down. "What about Nick?" Margaret hesitated. "That's complicated." My stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" She sighed, setting her coffee down on the nightstand. "He tried to kill himself last night." The air in the room turned thick, suffocating. I stared at her, unable to process what she had just said. "What?" "He sent a bunch of texts to people. His friends, his mom, even you, but you blocked him. He said he couldn't handle the shame. They found him just in time." I swallowed hard, my mind spinning. I had wanted revenge, but I had never wanted this. Margaret watched me carefully. "You're not responsible for his choices." I shook my head, trying to steady my breathing. I didn't think he'd do something like that." She exhaled. "None of us did. But people like him? They only care about their own suffering, not the suffering they cause others." I stared at the floor. I didn't feel guilt, not exactly. I felt exhausted, like my body was shutting down after running on adrenaline for too long. Margaret's phone buzzed, and she picked it up. Her face hardened. "What now?" I asked warily. She hesitated, then looked up at me. Your mom's missing. I blinked. What? She disappeared. George came home this morning to pack his things, and she was gone. No one knows where she is. A cold chill ran down my spine. She's not going to let this go. Margaret nodded. That's what I'm worried about. I didn't have time to dwell on it. The next few days were a blur of moving out of my old apartment, packing my things with the help of Margaret and her daughter, my cousin, Emily. Emily was the only person in the family, aside from Margaret, who had supported me. She had been in college for most of the past few years, keeping her distance from family drama, but the second she heard what happened, she showed up, no questions asked. The three of us worked quickly, boxing up my life, tossing out memories I never wanted to see again. I didn't cry. I didn't feel much of anything, until the night my mother came back. It was late. Margaret and Emily had gone home, leaving me alone in my nearly empty apartment for the last night before I moved. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a loud crash. Glass shattered. My head whipped toward the window just in time to see my mother climbing through it. Blood dripped down her arms where she had cut herself on the broken glass. Her eyes were wild, manic. She was breathing heavily, her chest rising and falling like an animal about to attack. My blood turned to ice. Mom? I whispered. She didn't say anything. She just charged at me. The first hit landed hard, her fist connecting with my jaw. Pain exploded across my face. I barely had time to react before she grabbed me by the hair, yanking me off the couch. You ruined me, she hissed, her voice venomous. You ruined everything. I struggled, kicking at her, but she was crazed, stronger than I had ever known her to be. She slammed me against the floor, her nails digging into my skin. I should have gotten rid of you when I had the chance, she screamed. Something inside me snapped. I brought my knee up, slamming it into her stomach. She gasped, stumbling back just enough for me to shove her off. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my phone, but before I could call for help, she lunged at me again. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a lamp, and smashed it over her head. She staggered, her eyes wide in shock. Then she collapsed. I ran. I ran out the door, out into the hallway, banging on my neighbor's door. Help. Call the police. The next few hours were a blur. The police arrived. My mother was gone by the time they searched my apartment. She had disappeared into the night, leaving behind a trail of blood and shattered glass. The cops took my statement, took photos of my injuries, and put out a warrant for her arrest. I sat in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, my hands still shaking. Margaret and Emily arrived not long after. Margaret hugged me tightly, stroking my hair, whispering, "She's never going to hurt you again." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that this nightmare was over. But deep down, I knew my mother wasn't finished yet. The bruises on my arms had started to fade, but the damage my mother left behind ran deeper than anything physical. It had been 2 weeks since she broke into my apartment, 2 weeks since the police issued a warrant for her arrest, and I hadn't slept a full night since. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, wild, furious, unhinged. I wasn't sure if I was more terrified of her being found or of the possibility that she never would be. Margaret and Emily refused to let me stay in the apartment alone. After that night, I packed up the rest of my things, and they helped me move into Margaret's house temporarily. It was supposed to be safe. It felt safe, but my mind wouldn't let me believe it. Every shadow made my heart race. Every creak of the floorboards made my stomach drop. I jumped at the sound of my own name. I was exhausted. Margaret was the one who suggested therapy. I had never been to therapy before. Growing up, my mother made sure we all knew that only weak people needed it. But after everything that had happened, the betrayal, the violence, the fact that I had spent 25 years being gaslit by the people who were supposed to love me, I knew I couldn't carry this alone anymore. I sat in the waiting room of the therapist's office, my hands clasped together in my lap. The place smelled like lavender and old books, the walls painted a soothing gray. A soft instrumental tune played from a speaker in the corner. I had expected the therapist to be some middle-aged woman in a pantsuit, stiff and clinical. Instead, Dr. Lillian Carter was younger than I had imagined, maybe in her late 30s, with warm brown eyes and curly auburn hair that framed her face. She wore a deep green sweater and a long skirt, and she looked at me like I was human, not like I was a problem to solve. I sat down in the chair across from her, shifting uncomfortably. "So, what brings you here?" she asked gently. I almost laughed. Where did I even begin? "I don't know how to move forward," I admitted. She nodded. Like she understood exactly what I meant. That's okay. We'll start where you can. And so I talked. For the first time in my life, I let it all spill out. The affair. The betrayal. The way my own family had kept it from me, encouraged it. My mother's manipulation. My sister and brother's callousness. The fact that my mother had wanted me gone before I even took my first breath. Dr. Carter listened without interruption, only nodding occasionally, her expression never shifting into pity or judgment. When I was finally done, I felt like I had run a marathon. She leaned forward slightly. You've spent a long time trying to meet other people's expectations, she said. You were raised to believe that your needs, your emotions, weren't as important as keeping the peace. But you're not living for them anymore. I swallowed the lump in my throat. I don't even know how to live for myself. That's what we'll figure out together. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to hope. I had cut Nick off completely. After the suicide attempt, his mother had reached out, but I told her, as kindly as I could, that I could not be responsible for him anymore. He had made his choices. I wasn't going to be one of them. His friend, Marcus, picked up the last of his things from the apartment. I had told Margaret to deal with it because I didn't even want to see his belongings again. The last thing I wanted was to find something of his and have some nostalgic part of me forget, even for a second, what he had done to me. Marcus had been one of the few of Nick's friends who had been disgusted by what he had done. When he picked up the boxes, he gave me a long look and said, "For what it's worth, he regrets it. But I don't expect you to care. I don't." And I meant it. Margaret and Emily sat with me in the lawyer's office when I filed for a restraining order against my mother. The lawyer, a tall woman named Rachel Pierce, had a sharp, no-nonsense attitude and a voice that brokered zero argument. "She's dangerous," she said after reviewing my case. "We'll make sure she doesn't come near you again." But I wanted more than just distance. I wanted justice. "I want to sue her," I said firmly. Rachel nodded. "We can do that." The process wouldn't be easy. My mother had been careful for years, always making sure she played the role of the perfect parent to outsiders. But she had slipped up. There were records. Old medical reports of bruises I had as a child that she had brushed off as accidents. Statements from people who had witnessed her rage before. The police report from the break-in. And now? Now she was a fugitive. The police still hadn't found her. She had disappeared after attacking me, slipping away like a ghost. Every time the phone rang, every time I heard a car pull up outside, my body tensed. I kept waiting for her to show up again. Dr. Carter had told me that my hyper-awareness was a form of trauma response, that I needed to remind myself that I was safe. But I wasn't sure I'd ever feel safe again, not as long as my mother was still out there. Moving was starting to feel like the only option. I couldn't stay in this town. Everywhere I went, there were ghosts. The coffee shop where I had sat with Kelly and planned my wedding. The restaurant where Nick had proposed to me. The grocery store where my mother had once slapped my hand when I reached for a bag of candy as a child. "I think I need to leave," I admitted to Margaret one evening. She sighed, nodding slowly. "I was waiting for you to say that." Emily perked up from her spot on the couch. "I can help you look for places. My friend just moved to Chicago, and she said there are some great apartments opening up." Chicago. A fresh start. It sounded terrifying, but it also sounded free. "I'll think about it," I said. Margaret reached over, squeezing my hand. "No matter where you go, you'll have us. You're not alone in this." For the first time in my life, I actually believed it. The next day, I put in my 2 weeks at work. I made arrangements with Rachel to keep me updated on the lawsuit. I sat with Dr. Carter and mapped out what I wanted for my future. My future, not the one other people had planned for me. And for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I started to imagine a life where I wasn't just someone's daughter, someone's fiancée, someone's afterthought. I started to imagine a life where I was just me. And that was worth everything.